gosh. Don't make me do that. I'm Dana Lehman. I direct CELT. Welcome to our annual symposium. And I just wanted to say a couple things before I hand the mic over to Carrie, who's going to MC for the day. First of all, I want to thank you for coming. We do not take for granted that this is a tough time of the semester to put time aside to come and focus on something related to your teaching. At this point in the semester, you might be like, I'm so sick of thinking about teaching, and I just want to get my grades posted. So we really appreciate that you're here. I also really want to take this moment to acknowledge our partners, the people who help us do what we do at CELT. So first of all, my partners are Carrie, Heather, and Jean, and Mary Davis, the best team, and Beatrix Roller, who can't probably hear right now, but I am very fortunate to have the best team and the most supportive and incredibly capable team. So thank you for all your hard work. We did more programming this semester than we've done since the start of COVID. So we're all a little bit weary and very excited to kind of hang out with you and party. This is our version of a party. I also want to thank partners who help us do programming on a regular basis. Ryan Rideau, Christina Aiken, I saw you. She's not here, but Tiffany House from IIE. We have other folks that we do programming. James Fisher has partnered with us this semester from Glad Eye. And so just really, really grateful for all the ways in which working with other folks makes our work better. So now I'm going to hand the mic over to Carrie. Carrie, I just want to say, she doesn't know I'm saying this. Carrie's been doing this for a few years now. She really leads the helm of the December Symposium and takes a critical role in helping to plan the university-wide teaching conference. Carrie is on top of every detail. Carrie does it without getting cranky. Carrie does it with an incredible amount of enthusiasm and passion. And I feel like it's particularly with the symposium, you can't hear what I'm saying if you're helping people on Zoom. God, Carrie, this is a moment. The people on Zoom will understand, right? People on Zoom? Yes. Yes, I'm kvelling. That's just a Yiddish word for like gushing over Carrie. And she's like, I'm not even paying attention to you. But I just want to say that this is something she steps up to do every year on top of everything else she does, which is growing in terms of her portfolio. So I just wanted to, can we give her an acknowledgement of her hard labor and her amazing attitude while she does it? So it is with great pleasure that I'm going to hand it over to you, the amazing and wonderful Carrie Cardamone.
Thank you. And hopefully the sound is a little better on Zoom. Let us know if it isn't. And thank you, Dana. This is also a pretty exciting event because it's the first big event where you've been our director. And so, yay. Thank you, Dana. So I'm going to get us started. I'm just launching today's event. We're very excited. It's a culmination of a series. We've been doing series of workshops, so they're low engagement. You can come to just one, but if you want to build up a theme, we have a theme this year on the learning sciences. We held 3 workshops this year. There are summaries of them on our website. So if you weren't able to attend, but you want a summary, some of them are recorded, some of them aren't. You can see the recordings or the slides or the handouts. But we're very excited this year because our December symposium will feature internally expertise on the learning sciences. The agenda is that the keynote and panel will be in here and on Zoom in the morning. At noon, those in person will have a lunch, and those on Zoom can get up and stretch their legs. And then in the afternoon, there'll be a workshop. Our wonderful partners with Educational Technology Services are going to host the online workshop for those of you wishing to attend the workshop online. Same bat time, same bat place. It's the same Zoom.
Channel.
Bat channel. So it's the same Zoom channel for anybody attending an online workshop. And then the applying learning sciences in your classroom bit will be in the lunchroom for those of you who are attending the workshop in the afternoon physically. So we'll have both options. And those of you who know CELT know that we always do something that is a little bit applied. And a lot of what we've been talking about in our fall series is how to do small tweaks, how to do small things that draw on the learning sciences that help engage students in the lecture. This is sort of, the disengagement we've been hearing. So we're going to do that with you. In Zoom, you're going to have a breakout in the room. We're going to ask you to talk to somebody next to you. If your best friend is to your right, you could turn to your left. And I want you to think about a story for a moment before you're paired. So I'm going to describe the whole activity so you know what you're doing. You're going to think about a story. You're going to have just 1 to 2 minutes to share your story. If you're in a triplet, it's closer to 1. If you're in a pair, it's 2 minutes each. Focus on listening when your partner is speaking. So don't take any notes, just listen to the words they're saying. Afterwards, we'll give you a moment, 2 minutes, to start write down, jot notes on what your partner said. And you're going to be using that later today. So that's why we're going to give you a few minutes to take the notes after the activity. So the prompt is recall a time when you struggled to learn something, but ultimately this led to durable and meaningful learning. So it could be an example where you failed a test, but it might be something where it was just really difficult. Like the first time I tried to point a telescope, that was really difficult for me. It took an hour. So like I remember that, but I also remember all the lessons from it. That's the kind of example we're looking for. So we're going to give everybody 5 minutes and we'll come back together. Heather has our breakout rooms. All right, turn to somebody next to you in the room.
That I sometimes tell my friends. With a couple of I know my sometimes I get to and I found that I something I'll never forget.
If you're in a pair, make sure you switch so the other person can tell their story.
Where I do this, mine was like, several people. All of the things that came to mind first happened where I had school here where so many of these the way I read it is I just accept that I don't
Okay, welcome back, everyone. So I'm going to give you now 2 minutes to write down some notes if you'd like on any, you can write it down on your cell phone, you can jot it down on a scrap of paper on the story you heard. And then we'll circle back to why we did this activity. So this is another example of an activity that draws on the learning sciences. We did a bunch of examples throughout the workshops this fall, but we wanted to put one more in here. We're going to come back to it, but we wanted to plant you with something that recalled on personal memories that made it real life applicable. What you're going to hear, you're going to be listening and thinking about maybe your memory, your partner's memory of struggling to learn something. That activated prior knowledge you had, it allows for that personal connection, and it gives you a sense to build community in the room. I know we're across 2 different platforms. It's a large lecture hall. Some of you know each other, some of you don't. And we always want you to have a little bit of joy and community at our CELT events. So we wanted to start with that right up front. And of course, to mix it up. It's one of the things we've been talking about in our workshops, mixing it up every 15 minutes or so that people have a different attention point. So throughout today, try to relate lessons from the story to what you're hearing, and we'll circle back later on and check in on what you found. I'm going to pass it over to Mary to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks. So I made some notes. I'm very excited to introduce Ayanna Thomas today, Professor of Psychology and also the Research Dean for Arts and Sciences. This is Ayanna's 17th year at Tufts. I know that because I met Ayanna 16 years ago when I came as a new faculty member. So the Arts and Sciences already knew how important Ayanna was going to be to service because they had her in her second year, her second year introducing the university to new faculty. And so we've been very close friends ever since. So Ayanna is a cognitive psychologist who studies memory. And I didn't have to Google this in order to know that if I had to just very briefly summarize Ayanna's work in 3 words, is memory is bad. How did I do? Right? Memory, well, so memory can be systematically manipulated. Memory can be bad when people are under stress. And that sometimes the way in which memory can be systematically kind of manipulated is to the detriment of particular populations. So I know Ayanna's done a lot of work in looking at eyewitness testimony, so different ways in which memory can be manipulated and cross-racial identification specifically. But Ayanna's also done a lot of work, and I'm sure we're going to hear about it today, in how memory relates to learning and learning sciences. Ayanna and I worked together maybe 10 years ago on a project that I was doing in my large econ course, where I was using poetry as a way to kind of hopefully make students remember better. And so her contribution to that project, especially the kind of memory science part, was really, really helpful. I also wanted to mention, just at Tufts, besides being the currently being the research dean here and bringing a lot of people together, particularly in the learning sciences, Ayanna's also served as the graduate director for psychology and has advised countless students in this area, some of which are now professors, teaching that memory is bad. Right? So with that, welcome, Ayanna.
That was a pretty good introduction. Okay, yeah, I was a little bit worried how Mary was going to introduce me, so we're in a good place. So hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. I have a talk today that I'm going to give. I'm going to try and get through it in about 30 minutes so we have time for the panel conversation, because I think that that's going to be really exciting and interesting. But as Mary said, you know, if you had to summarize my work and my perspective in 3 words, I would say not that memory is bad, but that memory is reconstructive. And the work that I'm going to talk about today comes from the perspective of thinking about how we as humans access memories. Now that access, the way that we retrieve that information, is really important from my perspective in the classroom and in a whole host of other domains. You'll hear from our panelists an alternative kinds of perspectives, but I think that we're going to complement each other in that context. So from the perspective of looking at memory retrieval processes, I'm going to talk about why I think memory retrieval is valuable when we think about classroom learning. And I'm going to talk about factors that might negatively impact successful retrieval and what that might mean for learning. So those are the goals. We're going to take it from the perspective of students not knowing. That is the theme for this particular session today. What does it mean to feel and sit with the perspective of not knowing? I'm used to it. I live in the perspective of not knowing things, and I think I've gotten comfortable. But when I was 20, I surely was not comfortable in that particular state. Our students do not presently feel comfortable in the perspective of not knowing. It may cause them stress and anxiety that might exacerbate that feeling of not knowing. So how do we break this cycle? I think about it from a perspective of how do we create robust memory representations so that they remain accessible even when students are experiencing that stress and anxiety. So let me talk about that for a moment. And I just want to pause, and for folks on Zoom, can you do me a favor and clap or raise your hand or do something to make sure you can hear me? Is it all good? All right, we're in a good place. So what causes feelings of stress and anxiety in the classroom? Well, if you ask many students in high school and in college, much of the stress and anxiety that they experience comes from performance. It comes from having to take a particular, maybe high stakes exam. And some of us give high stakes exam in this room, others of us don't, but it gives students, it results in this stress. Students have a desire to do well. And that desire to do well naturally conflicts with a state of not knowing, at least from the student's perspectives. That student's desire to do well has been associated with their subjective experience of stress, frustration, and anxiety. When we start to feel that stress and anxiety, we might turn our cognitive attention to it. So right now, like I do in any kind of talk I give, I am having a physiological response to this particular session, right? I'm here, I'm up in front of you, and I've done this 100 times. Yet I'm having a phase 1 stress response. I am used to it. I know what that is. My heart's racing a little bit. I'm maybe perspiring a little bit more. This is an experience that I've gotten used to. I'm used to this physiological response. Students in the classroom are not. When they start to experience this physiological change, they direct attention towards it. So when students are given some folk wisdom, and in fact, this is the wisdom that you will find if you go to educational testing services. Their website says for students to just calm down. Obviously, that is not the best advice when students are going into these situations. So even our largest testing services are not really sort of addressing the core problem. I'm just going to give you one perspective on how I think we might be able to address this problem. And I'm going to give you a perspective really that's sort of rooted in my tradition of scientific exploration. I think about a construct of worry, and I think about what is really sort of influencing this latent emotional state of worry. And a lot of research, and one particular model that I really like, suggests that worry results in individuals moving into a heightened state of vigilance. You become prepared to engage in whatever is causing that stress. This results in a physiological response. As I mentioned, I am having a phase 1 stress response. That is directly tied to a release of adrenaline and norepinephrine into my system. That is going to change the way I can engage in specific kinds of cognitive tasks. So today, and I'm going to do this quickly, I'm going to go through a number of things. I'm going to talk about what are the stressors that I've been looking at that students face in the classroom. And I'm going to talk about it through the context of taking high stakes exams, testing. Now, so how many of y'all gave a test or are giving a test this week? Is anyone giving a test? Yeah, we gave our last test as well. So many of us give exams to our students. How does that influence them? Even though testing can produce a state of anxiety, frustration, and stress in our students, testing, or retrieval practice, as I'll refer to it, also results in very robust memory representations. So there's this tension because testing causes stress and anxiety, yet testing can be maybe useful as a tool for learning. So how do we navigate this particular tension and allow students to learn the value of engaging in this kind of active state of not knowing? Because when you take a test, you have to assess what it is you know versus not know. How do you get students to get into that state without causing them the stress and anxiety that typically accompanies it? And finally, we'll talk about, and one thing that my grad student who's going to be on the panel has been doing this semester, we'll talk about how students experience this in the classroom, how they are perceiving this. So the work I'm going to present, the experiments I'm going to show you are experiments that are done both in the laboratory and in the classroom. And we will talk about the differences that seem to emerge when you take these laboratory designs and you try and employ them in the classroom. So as I mentioned, stress is a physiological change. It is a response to something in the environment. Generally, when we have an acute stress response, that is going to result in 2 stages. That phase 1 stress response that generally happens about, immediately after and sort of lasts about 10 minutes after the initial acute stressor. So if we witness an accident outside, you'll be in an acute stress response. You'll go into that fight or flight state. But after that fight or flight state, our body, about 20 to 30 minutes later, goes into a restorative or reparative state. And in that state, about, again, 20 minutes later, there's a release of a hormone known as cortisol into the system. Cortisol is important because it results in a disruption to memory retrieval. So if you've ever had the experience, or if you know of anyone who's ever had the experience of freezing under pressure, they are freezing. They cannot access information because they are in this phase 2 physiological response. That is what's going on. Acute stress can impact learning and performance. And there's a lot of research looking at this in high stakes kinds of jobs, as well as in the classroom. And just to simplify it clearly for you, when I think about memory, when many of us memory researchers think about it, we think about memory as being divided into several primary stages, right? But in this context, right now, you're listening to this information, and we are engaging in short-term or working memory. That information that we are talking about right now may or may not be transferred to long-term memory. I hope it is. I hope that it gets there. And that transfer process is the memory formation. And that memory is consolidated, and hopefully next week, or when you're relaxing after the semester, you're going to just be thinking back to this talk and how great it was, and you're going to retrieve some details. It is that access, that retrieval, that gets disrupted when subjects are in a phase 2 stressor. And there's a lot of evidence in this particular literature to demonstrate that that phase 2 stressor disrupts memory retrieval. Now, this representation just represents all of the different studies that have been done, looking at how that phase 2 stress disrupts memory retrieval. Generally, in these kinds of studies, what researchers do is they do a very simple design where they'll present some new information for subjects to learn. Maybe it's a series of words or word pairs or pictures. And then they will induce a stressor in the context of the lab. So what we do in my lab and what we've done, we do 2 kinds of stressors, a Trier social stress test or a cold pressor task. And these, and I'll define them, but generally these have a socio-evaluative component where the subject is put in a situation where they have to perform and then they are being evaluated. In the cold pressor task, as an example, we ask subjects to place their arm in a cold bucket of water. Yeah. And they have to maintain their arm in that bucket of water while being evaluated by the experimenters for their reactions. In addition, we give them a number, I think it's maybe 2017 or 2025 or something like that. And we ask them to count backwards by 17. And every time they're wrong, we say, wrong, start over. Wrong, start over. It's terrible. We can talk about it. But I have many things to say, but I won't. What's reliable is that these kinds of stress induction tests reliably result in an increase in cortisol during the phase 2 response. It also reliably results in subjects saying subjectively, yes, I hate you. This is stressful. Testing, retrieval, practice put subjects in a state of experiencing a phase 2 stress response or an acute stressor. When students go in for a high stakes exam, their fear of not knowing, their desire to do well places them in this particular context, resulting potentially in their inability to access the information that they might have to retrieve in order to perform well on this test. That might be a debate, and we can talk about it. However, we also know that retrieval practice or taking repeated tests during the context of learning new information, hey, I just presented you some things, now I want you to try and retrieve it and say it back to me, or let's talk about it, actively engage that material. We know that that is going to result in better retention of that material at a long term than just repeatedly passively studying it and reading it over and over again, right? We know this as instructors, but our students, do they know this? So that we'll talk about it. But the data here come from a classic study. So this is by Roediger and Karpicki 2006, and this was published in one of the, I think, high-profile journals of my field, Psych Science. And they compared subjects who engaged in repeated studies. So they got some information to learn, and they studied that information, they just reread it, and then they reread it again after a short delay, and then again after another short delay. And compared that to subjects who studied that information, took a test on that same information. Doesn't matter how they did, they just tried. And then they took another one, and then they took another one. Look at what happens at 1 week. So at a 1 week retention interval, a final test is given. We bring subjects back, they bring subjects back 1 week later. Subjects who engaged in testing as a form of learning did better on this previously studied material than subjects who engaged in repeated study. So that data suggests to us that testing or retrieval practice results in more robust memory representations that might be accessible. So the question is it accessible? Does that help bypass that acute stress response of freezing under pressure? Can we think about testing as a learning tool as opposed to a means to just assess what knowledge people have? Can we change that approach? So what we did in the lab, and this was maybe 2015, we just gave subjects simple word pairs to study. These were English Swahili word pairs. We wanted subjects to have no knowledge of it, so we made sure that we were showing them new material. They engaged in study practice or retrieval practice during learning. And the second session happened 1 week later where we brought them back in. So it's very much like that Roediger and Karpicki study. However, we did something important. We introduced stress prior to retrieval, just as students in the classroom are going to experience stress before they go into that high stakes final that they're all about to go into, right, in this week or next week. I have no idea what day it is. So half of our subjects were stressed. The others did not receive stress. We divided recall to look at recall that happens during the phase 1 stress response. That stress response where norepinephrine and adrenaline's in the system, where we're in that sort of heightened state of vigilance and being prepared, and compared it to that phase 2 stress response about 20 minutes later, where cortisol may disrupt retrieval processes. And this is an example of the word pair. It's very simple. The target is garden. I've used this slide a lot, so it's the one Swahili word I know. The first thing we did was we gave subjects a subjective assessment of their experience of stress. And what you can see is that subjects who were in the stress group, after receiving that stress induction, that TSST, so that gray bar, that last gray bar, they are indicating, yes, in fact, I feel more stressed. So that's one validating point. We also measured cortisol. So we take saliva samples in the lab and at different time points. So baseline is right after a relaxation period. And after 20 minutes after the TSST is when cortisol should be at a high point. And what you're looking at is 30 minutes post-stress induction. Subjects who did go through stress induction demonstrated significantly higher levels of cortisol than those that did not. Now, as opposed to going through all of the bars on this graph, I want you to focus just on what's going on in test 2. So again, test 2 is during that phase 2 stress response. In prior studies, subjects who just learned the material would demonstrate impairment. That is, they would perform less well after being stressed in retrieving the information than subjects who were not stressed. Stress impairs retrieval. And we found that for those subjects who engaged in study practice, denoted as SP down here. But for subjects who engaged in retrieval practice, we found no impairment. That is when, I like that. Yeah, it was audible. Like, yeah. Retrieval practice during learning, actively engaging the material during the process of learning, resulted in subjects being able to maybe bypass that phase 2 impairment. Now, we've done many experiments in my lab over the course of the last 5 or so 8 years now, looking at why. But this is not a talk about that. That's for my psychology colleagues. I'm just going to summarize some of the main points, and then I'm going to go into how we think about this in terms of classroom learning. So we think about these kinds of ways in which we learn, and sort of repeatedly thinking about things and actively engaging it as leading to memories that are context-free. So you have 2 types of memories, right? 2 main types of memories. Those memories of the what, the where, the when, the how, right? The episodic content, the autobiography of our lives. And that's the bad memory that Mary mentions. That's the fallible memory. But we also have memories of the general knowledge that we've accumulated over the course of our lives, that we accumulate through our experiences, that we accumulate in the context of the classroom. So if I ask you, for example, I'm not going to ask you this too, but this is an example. What did you have for breakfast this morning? Some people just had breakfast out here, so you remember that. You also remember who you might have been chatting with, right? As episodic. If I ask you what you had for breakfast 2 weeks ago, it becomes harder. You can answer it, but you don't have a clear recollective experience. Now, if I ask you something else, like, hey, what's the capital of Massachusetts? Everybody know? I don't know sometimes, so. But you know. You don't necessarily remember where you learned it, but you have that information. Engaging in retrieval practice results in making these context-free memories that remain accessible. So there are pros and cons, right? The pro to thinking about testing is that, hey, it might result in these maybe robust memory representations, but the primary con is that it still results in anxiety, frustration, and stress. So what I wanted to do, and what we did in 2016 was, okay, can we do this in the classroom? What happens if I take this idea and think about it in my Psych 28 class? That's cognitive psychology. I had about 60-ish, maybe 50 students in this class in 2016, maybe 2017. And I said, okay, can I make these students, can I force them, which is what I did, to engage in retrieval practice during learning? How will that impact their performance in the class? And so we employed an experimental design where subjects were divided into groups, and we changed the groups over the course of the semester. So sometimes during the course of lecture, and this was a class where I did traditional style, I lectured for 20 minutes, and then I gave them either an opportunity to engage in retrieval practice of the material that we just lectured about, or to just review that information. And we matched the design. And we switched the groups over the course of the semester, so all students got to experience all different kinds of processing. Not only was I interested in how subjects would remember, or students in this case, would remember the information that they were tested on later, but I also wanted to see if that engagement in retrieval practice had broader implications, that it resulted in building conceptual knowledge of this material. And so I changed the format of questions, and I looked at whether you could see changes or transfer effects between being tested on one idea in one context and retrieving a complementary idea in another context, which is what we often do when we give exams in our class. These students were troopers. They were 32 interval sessions over the course of this class. They took a lot of practice tests. I also gave them a lot of tests because I was collecting data. I gave them 6 what I called unit cumulative exams, and I gave them an impressively long final exam. And this final exam had over 100 multiple choice questions. It had 6 large essay questions. I also was interested in their confidence, so I asked them how confident they were in their answers after what these students, they gave me the best course reviews. Who would have thought? I think they just sort of got so invested in this. So good for them. I'm only showing you a very small piece of the data. And so the data, I'm just looking at transfer to related concepts. So very different than what we looked at with the Roder and Karpicki study and what I showed you with the Swahili English word pairs. Now I test them on a concept, let's say about episodic and semantic memory that we just talked about. And I test them later on a related concept about those ideas, different kind of question, maybe different question format. And we found that subjects who engaged in that retrieval practice during the course of initial learning did better even on those related conceptual related questions. So that's another piece. But I'll tell you, what I didn't ask students in this class directly was, hey, how do you feel about this? Do you hate me? Do you hate this class? Maybe. So we decided that we were going to look at that in the present study. Can we think about testing as a learning tool and really effectively employ it in the classroom, while also making sure that students feel okay about what we are doing? Because when you are taking a test, regardless of whether you're taking the test at the end of the semester as a final exam or during the course of learning the new material, you as a learner are still placed in a situation of not knowing. How do you feel about that state? And do you want to avoid it? So when are students more likely to expend this effort? When you engage in retrieval practice, it is effortful. It is far more effortful than just rereading the material, right? Just rereading the material, passive engagement, it doesn't require too much, but there's cognitive demand when you're asked to search your memory, which you're going to be asked to do, I think, and retrieve some information. But we found, and some research demonstrates, that students are more likely to expend this cognitive effort when they perceive a course as being more important. So maybe calculus. Students have a higher need for cognition, are also more likely to expend this effort. And students who have a goal towards mastery, a goal to really truly understanding, and not having a goal of performance, earning that A, are also more likely to want to expend that effort. Looking at when students are making these choices really brings up an important construct to consider. And that is the idea of metacognitive processes in the classroom. That idea of assessing what it is we do and don't know, and employing the appropriate strategies to maybe reduce the states between not knowing and knowing. Metacognition, monitoring and control, is monitoring and control of the cognitive state, right? We are always assessing what it is we do know versus what it is we don't know, and adopting strategies to move forward. Metacognition is informed by the goals that we might have going into the situation. Do I have a goal to just getting through this course? Or do I really want to understand the material? But it's also influenced by what we can bring to the course itself. Am I tired? Did I eat breakfast? Do I have a demanding semester? Do I have things going on at home that are really sort of sapping my resources and making me unable to engage? Am I aware of these things, and how is it impacting my strategic regulation? We've broadened this concept to think about metacognition and meta-affect as interacting. So I'm going to define meta-affect as awareness of the emotional states associated with cognition. You can define it in a number of different ways, but that is how I choose to define it for these studies. How do we feel about particularly cognitively demanding kinds of engagement? Do we want to do that? Do we want to stay away from it? So now, thinking about it from this perspective, what do students think about effortful learning? What do our students presently in 2024, going into 2025, think about effortful learning? And I'm getting to the perspective that my students don't necessarily want to engage in effortful learning. I had a semester, and it was an eye-opening semester. I hadn't been teaching since pre-pandemic. And I went into the classroom this past semester, and I realized that I know things have changed, but I was exposed to that change. We asked subjects in the different samples. We had 330 people. We tested these people online. And we simply asked them, what do you think is more effective for learning? If you have to choose between study practice and retrieval practice, what do you think? 65%. And then we asked subjects, what study strategy do you think might induce anxiety and frustration? So we asked them, hey, if you have to pick between these, what are you picking? So in this sample of 335 subjects online, 65% of those subjects understood that retrieval practice might be better for learning. That's what they said, right? We didn't lead them in any way. 90% of these subjects also said that retrieval practice was more likely to cause frustration and stress and anxiety. So there's this tension, right? Where people might know that it might be useful for learning, but they also recognize that it's going to put them in a state that they might not want to be in. So we wanted to see, okay, well, if we gave subjects the opportunity to choose what study strategy they would engage in, depending on their goals, how would they do it? So we did this work online. And when we do these online studies, we develop an experimental design, and we present it to a sample who engages with the task. We used to do these in the lab, bring subjects in, but COVID changed that, and now we can collect much larger samples and more diverse samples this way. So we gave subjects in these studies an opportunity to experience what it's like to engage in study practice and retrieval practice. And then we gave them hypothetical scenarios with different goals in mind. And then we looked to see how they would distribute time studying. So just asking them, okay, you have this goal, you've experienced these tasks. Now, how would you allocate your time? they're allocating their time to a hypothetical student. So I'll show you those data. But again, we went back to word pairs and we gave them experience just engaging in repeated study and repeated testing with feedback. Notice that that feedback also may be negative in context. We want to highlight that there might be frustration associated with it. And then we gave them these goals. Subjects were divided into 3 groups. They got 3 different kinds of goals. The most important sentence is highlighted in each of these, but I'll read the first one to you. A fellow student is studying new word pairs. They know that certain study strategies are effective for learning. Their primary goal is to learn as many word pairs as possible. Blah, 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 blah. What are they going to do? You have 2 strategies to choose. How are you going to allocate your time? That's one group. Another group gets that same passage, except the critical sentence is, they know that certain study strategies may cause frustration and anxiety. Their primary goal is to safeguard their emotional well-being during study. And then we look to see where they allocated their time. Proportionally, what were students doing for this hypothetical student? When students were given the goal towards learning, they allocated more time towards retrieval practice than when given the goals to safeguarding their emotional state. Less time was allocated towards retrieval practice. You'll notice that when students had got no goals, so we had a control group, they're also allocating more time towards retrieval practice. So the question is, what's going on with folks in that no-go group? So what we found out was when we broke this down and we looked at the data. So this is just the number of students who viewed a particular practice as more or less effective. So the blue bar is the view of student, or the number of students who viewed retrieval practice as more effective than study practice. And you can see that in our no goal group, most of those folks viewed retrieval practice as more effective for learning. So even without the goal, they knew that retrieval practice would be more effective for learning, and they instituted a goal of learning over well-being when given these material. We just happen to have a sample in our learning group of subjects who almost were 50-50 split in terms of what they thought was a more effective strategy, learning or retrieval practice. So when we just look at the people from the blue bars who really viewed retrieval practice as more effective, when we just look at those subjects, there you can see clearly that when subjects are given the learning goal, they are more likely to allocate to this hypothetical students more time to retrieval practice than subjects in our well-being group. So when subjects in this online sample are just given a specific goal of either learning or well-being, that goal changes the way that they are allocating how they study, how they engage in strategic regulation. We also we changed the design and we just told subjects how retrieval practice and study practice works in a different experiment. So without giving them the experience of it, just telling them how it works, now doing the allocation, we see the same pattern of data. So same pattern, now you know you're allocating more time to retrieval practice when given a learning goal than when given a goal towards well-being. And finally, we changed the scenarios themselves and we asked students to allocate time for themselves. It's no longer a hypothetical student, now it's you. Same pattern. So that's 3 online samples over probably, what do you say, 900 subjects across those? Yeah, so almost 1,000 subjects across these 3 experiments. Now, what happens when you take it to the classroom? So that's what we did. That's what Lanang and I did this past semester in Psych 28 again. And in Psych 28, what we did was we went into the class, and it was a standard lecture class with this material. And at the beginning of every class, we asked subjects 2 primary questions. To what extent do you feel motivated to learn new material today? Beginning of the class. And also, to what extent do you want to relax and enjoy the course? Our idea of well-being. I want to relax. I'm going to sit back and enjoy this. And then we asked them to select the practice type that best meets their current states. So first, I want to show you data that surprised us. So this is over the course of the semester. I know it's tiny, but these are dates on the x-axis. So this is 9/16 all the way to 12/2. Every time we measured this. The red boxes are highlighting what times before and after critical exam points. Our first exam was 5 points of their final grade. Second was 25, back to 5, then 25. We hypothesized that the weight of the exam would change these, but it didn't. The weight of the exam did not matter, at least when asking them these questions. The blue line is their goal towards learning. The orange line is their, hey, I want to relax and enjoy this course. You'll notice when you calculate the slope of the lines that that orange line, that slope's not changing all that much. Of course they want to relax and enjoy the course every class. Who wouldn't? I hope they did. But what changed over the course of the semester was our goal towards learning. You calculate the slope of that line, you see a dramatic shift. This is when I gave memory lectures. So it's cognitive psychology. I spend 5 lectures talking about memory. I give them lectures on the value of retrieval practice. Didn't change. Any guess what's going on here? That's the election. Yeah, I know. So these data were really important for me as an experimentalist because there are things going on outside the course of this class that are directly impacting students that I don't capture in the lab, and I barely captured in the context of the way that we designed it. But look at that big effect, right? Now, I want to show you one last piece of data, which I think is really neat. This is the selection of, so students could choose again, hey, we're going to review the material at every class. Do you want to do this through retrieval practice or just restudy? This is the proportion of students who chose retrieval practice over the course of the semester. And you can see a clear shift. 50% of the subjects start off saying, yeah, retrieval practice, let's do it. Doesn't matter their goal. And then there's a dramatic drop. And they don't care anymore. Here's what happens when the memory lectures happen. Yeah, you get a little bump. So I got 2 or 3 students coming back. Yay. So we're right now, we're doing individual differences metrics and really looking to see, okay, who are these students that are they consistent? Is it consistent who's choosing retrieval practice? It tends to be. It tends to be the students who actually are also scoring highest in terms of their final grades. We have some other individual differences that we're going to look at in that context. So stay tuned. Hopefully the paper will be out next year. I'm not writing it, Lana is. So the lab to the classroom has taught us some important lessons, right? That students, we've started to collect some survey data from our students, and they have, even after the memory lectures, they still have misperceptions on the efficacy of retrieval practice. In fact, some of our students would say to us, hey, yeah, I chose not to do retrieval practice because I thought just typing out, because we asked them to type out the same, their answer for study practice. So we show them the answer and just have them type it. They're just copying. And some students would say that would be better for learning than trying to retrieve something I don't know. And our data suggests that that's not the case, right? We also found that semester-long motivations are a challenge for us all, right? That there are going to be dramatic shifts over the course of the semester that are going to influence subjects' goals or students' goals, motivations, and desires. and that we might have to start thinking about what that means and how we can keep students engaged and motivated as the semester starts to wear them down. Because I think that that's what's going on. I think that this research is important, and this is why we do it, right? Because students are steering away from certain courses. They are steering away from these courses because, as they report, it results in high workload and stress. They want to avoid that. Students are consciously avoiding these courses, and that's doing us all a disservice. So how do we shift perception and get people back into the state of wanting to feel that it's okay to not know, that it is okay to be confused and work through that confusion? All of this work sort of relates back to the framework that we're talking about in the relationship between metacognition and meta-affect, and I hope that the panelists and I will continue that conversation. All of the data, I don't collect this data, the grad students do. All of the data, so Amy Smith got her PhD in, I think, 2018. She's on living the life and doing great. And Lan Ang is gonna get her PhD in a few months, but we're not letting her go because she's gonna stay in postdoc, so that's the way it goes. But we thank them for this work, and I thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're actually gonna call the panelists up, right? And we're gonna do questions and discussion at the end. Is that the plan? Yes. Okay, just wanted to confirm. So yes, we're gonna call the panelists up.
Yay, panelists. So be nice to you. We're back to you. We're-
Okay, so hi everyone again. I'm gonna introduce each of the panelists briefly, and then I guess the first question I'm gonna have is, from each of your perspectives, what are your reactions, just in a few sentences to this work, and how do you think about it in the context of the way that you engage in the classroom? So our first panelist right next to me is Lan Ang, also Bella Do, who is a graduate student in my lab and has been in the lab for 3 years and works in the space of education and psychology. She came to the lab already with a master's in educational psychology. David Hammer, who has been, how long have you been here?
Actually, not all in a row. This is my 20th year at Tufts.
Not all in a row. 20 years, not all in a row. Former chair of the Department of Education, collaborator on a lot of projects where we think about these things. And so David does this from the context of physics education, especially. And then Heather Nathans, who I've also had the pleasure of working with over the last few years in the dean's office, and we're sad that she's gone, but has also been at Tufts for a bazillion years, but not all in a row.
No, not all in a row. I did my PhD here till 99 and then came back in 2013.
Yeah. And also former chair of her department, but I think important to this conversation is Heather takes her work and thinking about teaching into the context of the carceral system. So we're going to talk about all of those perspectives. So from there, and I think I'll work from Heather back, perspectives, and maybe Mike for the folks on Zoom.
So thank you. And that was so interesting. And it was actually incredibly timely because, as Ayanna mentioned, I have the privilege of teaching with the Tufts in Prison program. And if you have any questions, ask me at lunch. And I'm teaching a class right now about acting Shakespeare, in part because the prison system, if Shakespeare is in the title, they think it must be good for folks. And my students are in the process of learning how to perform their monologues. And so they are having to remember Shakespearean monologues. And not only are they having to remember them, they're having to perform them in front of other folks. And this is a maximum security prison. And not all of my students are in the same unit. So they don't all know each other outside the context of my classroom. So as you were talking about the stress factors and the cortisol levels, I was thinking, yep, I see that. Oh, yep, totally see that. And I see the ways in which they are able to retrieve and not able to retrieve. And so I'm happy to talk more about this, but one of the ways that I try to create spaces where they feel like they can actually enter into learning is I enter the space of not knowing, and I invite them to teach me. So I was mentioning this when we were chatting before. Does anyone know what a stanky leg dance is? Wow, I see nods. Okay. I did not, and my students taught me how to stanky leg a few weeks ago, and they were just laughing their heads off at me. And I was like, hey, I'm game to stanky leg, because the more I act the clown, the fool, the I'm okay with not knowing, it creates an invitation, it creates laughter, it creates trust, it creates a space where it's okay for them not to know. And so I tried to think about, I love the way you framed it. And I was like, oh, now I have a language. Try to frame that combination of we have to work on retrieval, but we also have to simultaneously think about well-being. So I'm going to shush and turn it over to David, but I'm excited to talk more.
Whoa. Okay. Wow. So yesterday, I think it was Ayanna said, David, you're going to hate my talk. And yesterday I said, I know. But I don't hate is a really strong word. No, there's lots of overlap, but I will say, I think that you're doing really wonderful work on aspects of learning that don't help people learn physics. And I think it possibly expands from there. So I teach physics, and if you approach the learning of physics as a retention of information that someone else has provided, you don't do well at physics by any measures, by measures of, and Dennis says I'm not supposed to show research. So forgive me, I'm sorry, I'm gonna do it. There is a great deal of evidence to support that claim. And in some other context, I could present you with that evidence. If you approach learning as the retention of information, you don't do well in physics. I'm actually like, I see Mitch sitting by there. I'm not sure how that applies to biology. And I think that there's going to be some kind of balance of retention of information and reasoning. And if there's a moment during this, I'll toss out a physics question to get people to do a little physics. That's the core of the challenge for me. Physicists, scientists are professionals at engaging with not knowing. So I see the title, and Vasal asked me if I had anything to do with the title, and I said no. I was the third choice, I think, for being the panelist on this in this spot. Others who said no told me. Sorry, Ayanna stuck with me. But the thing that we're really after a lot and explicitly is learning to engage with not knowing. That's the target of my teaching. It's not about retrieving information. It is about being in the situation of being confused and thinking, whoa, cool, I have a problem. This will be fun. That's what a scientist is. A scientist is someone, there are other things that define a scientist. The image from outside the field of scientists is people who know a lot. But what scientists are, in their profession, day to day, are people who seek out not knowing. They seek out, where is there something I'm confused about? And what their expertise is, centrally, is in engaging in that moment. So I want top priority, really first priority, is my students to learn to engage in a moment when they don't know. And ideally, they come to enjoy those moments. I know that in life, they enjoy those moments, because they do Sudoku puzzles. Sudoku isn't as big as it used to be, but it's still, they do Wordle, they do How many of you do puzzles? You seek out moments. If the puzzle is already filled in, oh, that's too bad. You want to be in the situation of not knowing and trying to figure out. And I think if you really do this a lot, you enjoy it when the puzzle is hard. And as you get better and better at it, you build up stamina and interest and excitement. And if you get to a place where you're doing it and you're saying, whoa, this is hard, and part of you says, cool, then you're at a place that I'm trying to accomplish with my students. I think I took too much time.
No, perfect.
Oh, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm the one and only graduate student here among the two faculty, three faculties. So I may be a little bit nervous, but yeah. So my research focus on the intersections between educational and cognitive psychology, and I have to disagree with David for a moment because there's a large body of research demonstrate the robust benefits of retrieval practice on long-term retentions. And not only for long-term retention, retrieval practice is beneficial because it informs you of what you know and what you don't know. And there has been like so many interventions being done in the literature, trying to get students to choose retrieval practice for their own learning, and when they study in their own time. However, we haven't been able to successfully persuade students to engage in retrieval practice, and probably because retrieval practice put them into a state of I would say a state of being aware of what they know and what they don't know, right? And the state of not knowing make them feel uncomfortable, and sometimes can be threatening to their self-perceptions of their competence. And this kind of feeling, they make them, they lead students to avoid these situations that reveal the state of not knowing, which lead to non-optimal way of learning, which is like engage in study practice, copying information, rereading information passively instead of actively retrieve the information. So I would say that our line of research, it has been revealed some new insight into literatures in order to help us develop much better and much more effective interventions that can engage students in retrieval practice. I don't know if it's like a good news for David or not, but at least it's a good news for us. Yeah, it's a good news for us because it reveals that not only we cannot persuade students by just telling them this is why and how retrieval practice enhance your learning, but we have to create a supportive learning environment where retrieval practice or any other effective study strategies not going to threaten their well-being as well. So we need to make sure that we have to consider not only the learning goal of students, but also their goal to safeguard their well-being. That I think is the most important takeaway from this, from the series of study we have been doing on the effects of goal on student study choice and their choice of study strategies. And yeah,
That's perfect. Thank you. Okay, I think that we can agree on one space. I'll let David, I know David wants to respond, but before we have a response and dialogue, I think one of the things that we all seem to resonates with all of our work and all of the ways that we engage students in the classroom is getting students to a space where they're okay and feel comfortable in that place of not knowing and that place of confusion. So I guess I will start, we'll start with David and then we'll ask David, and then maybe I'll hear from the rest of the panelists. What are some strategies that you might have worked for you or that you might think would be effective in getting students to feel okay in that space? We'll start there.
I first have to respond to the good news. And for some reason I'm echoing on people approaching me at the metro station at the T and saying, "Have you heard the good news?" It's a very different topic, but I've read the literature. I believe you that if there's a body of information to retain. I was in theater a lot in college, and I had to memorize. I had to memorize my lines for the play, and it's some work, and it really retrieval practice. Awesome. If the work is to remember information, I totally believe retrieval practice is awesome. If the hard work is reorganizing information that you already have, you've lived in this physical world your whole life. And when I come along to teach physics, the stuff that I would like you to be grappling with is how something that's intuitively obvious all right, quickly, here's a quick physics question. I was thinking I should have brought some equipment, but happily teaching physics, you always have equipment because it's everywhere around you. If I throw my keys up in the air, if you took an introductory physics course, you'd learn to calculate how much time it takes. And it actually, it connects with your common sense. Oh, thank you. If I throw my keys, for Zoom, right. If I was thinking my voice will reach the room, but if I throw my keys up in the air and you take an introductory physics course, you learn to calculate, it's one of the early problems, how much time it takes to go up and come back down. And one day in a lecture, keys are not affected very much by air resistance. So you can't blow your keys off the table. So air resistance plays very little role. So it's actually a pretty easy calculation. One day in a lecture, a student asks, they're always saying neglect air resistance, but what if you included air resistance? Would that make it take more time or less time, or would it not have an effect? And I said, whoa, I love the question. That the student could construct that as a question is doing physics really well. It's not retrieval. I, in that moment, had a phase 1 stress response because the answer wasn't obvious to me. And here I am, the instructor, and being in this position, I was telling Lon, being in this position, you're supposed to be the expert. We're standing up, we have the microphone. We're supposed to be the experts communicating truth to you all. I didn't know, but I'm used to that kind of, and I thought, whoa, cool. What a great question. So I did a thing that I try to encourage teachers to do always, is throw the question back out to the room. Even if you know the answer, you should throw the question back out to the room. But if you don't know the answer, then really great. And you can protect yourself about knowing the answer or not if you're concerned by doing that regardless. And then they don't know whether you're just being pedagogically right for next semester. So I threw the question back out of the room and heard arguments, and people come up with arguments. That, to be in that position, did I say what the question was? Oh yes, what happens if there's no air resistance? You could try it actually, and I have a wadded up tissue paper in here. It's only moderately clean, so it's good for you to back up. If I were to throw this up in the air and try to do it with the same speed, so a great technique, put them both in your hand and throw them up at the same time, and which one takes less time. But to generate arguments, that is being in the situation of not knowing. And it's the kind of thing that I bet some of you are thinking, oh, wait, I think that's going to be slower because no, air resistance slows things down, but wait, it won't go as high. So I don't like, as you can think of multiple possibilities, that is being a scientist, that's doing science. That's what I want to teach. Retrieval practice doesn't help with that. It's not retrieving. It's not retrieving. But you have a response. So what did you ask me? Oh, what strategies do I do? But I'm taking up too much time. So I'll get to strategies in another cycle.
Okay, I just want a quick response. Everything that you said that rests on retrieval. That's that there's, but David and we've been doing this for years. So we'll come back to it offline, and we'll move to Heather for kind of strategies to get people comfortable in that state.
Although I am looking forward to the arm wrestling portion of the conference. I think that's going to be awesome. I think that's going to be exciting. So, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about a lot of folks imagine that the hardest part of acting is memorizing the lines, right? Like it is the most common question that actors get asked. How do you learn all those lines? And it is definitely complicated. It is actually the least challenging part of being a successful performer. And I can see my students starting to realize that and starting to realize that retrieval is the foundation of it, but then they have to build all of these other things on top of it. But one of the things that I was thinking about that I often use to create a kind of environment where I hope people can learn is I actually use a lot of ritual in my classrooms. I use a lot of warm-up ritual, a lot of this is how we start class ritual, a lot of returning to the same little points, little in jokes that we have kind of ritual. We actually, because it's a performance class, we spend a lot of time thinking strategically about stress reduction and breath control and physical control, because you have to acknowledge that the performer has to be in control of their body. And so one of the things we think about is how do you learn to breathe in a way that lets you access your voice, your physicality? How do you learn to stretch and warm up in a way that lets you access your body? And we talk a lot about the way in which stress and trauma, and goodness knows people in a maximum security prison have a lot of experience with trauma, in which all of those things inhibit your ability to access as a performer, as an artist, as an imaginative thinker. And one of the things that I have been so moved by, so appreciative of, are students writing in their journals about seeing the ways in which learning how to breathe again and use their voice again, but use it with control and understanding that they now can have some mastery over the ways in which they express themselves is so meaningful, particularly in an environment that is not in any way conducive to lack of stress or free expression of any kind of imagination. So rituals, but also really acknowledging that part of what you have to do in order to do the things you want to do is learn how to manage the stress. So I'll turn to
Yeah, it's really interesting to have a panel of like all the experts from different fields of study that may disagree with me on the robust effects of visual practice. But I think in psychology, like especially within the cognitive psychology, psychology 28, I still believe that there could be a robust benefit of visual practice. And
how does I mean, I guess I'd love you to think about what strategies you think you're going to use as an instructor to get students comfortable with, let's say, engaging in something that.
Yeah, so before answering that questions, I want to share some of the data that we collected from student response in a follow-up survey. So in the classroom study, we asked participants to choose between study practice and visual practice. And we did not evaluate, so their performance wasn't evaluated at all. They received full credit just for participation. So we assume that it's like a very low stake activities that didn't have a high risk, like a significant risk to their final grade. But still, the majority of students chose study practice, which is a non-optimal study strategies over visual practice. And in a follow-up survey, we asked them why they did it. And many students said that because they feel like study practice is much more relaxing. I think it's much more relaxing and comfortable activities for them. And they feel like if they have to engage in visual practice, they feel a lot of pressures to get it right? Even though it's a very low stake kind of activity and we didn't judge their performance at all, they still feel pressure to get it right. So they feel like they haven't learned the materials well enough to recall the information from memories. So it reflects a common misconception that visual practice is just an evaluation tool. And it's only beneficial when you already master the materials. However, they should actually perceive it as a learning tool to build up the mastery instead of like engaging it after mastering the materials. So I think one of the ways that can help students engage in these kind of effective learning practice is to develop a supported learning environment where we reframe the way students think of not knowing or making mistakes in the classrooms, right? So to think of it as a very natural and essential part of the learning progress. And it's totally okay for you to make mistake, and we're not going to judge you. And it actually, and we should provide feedback in terms of the learning process instead of like the performance or the accuracy of their performance. And I can think of many different activities that can lead to that kind of supported learning environments. For example, I don't know if you guys are aware, familiar with the term metacognition. Oh yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah, of course, I just talk about metacognition. Yeah, it's like so we can have students practice metacognitive activities, asking people to reflect on their learning experiences and identify the gap in their knowledge, what they don't know and what they know. And then, so that kind of and student can receive credit for it, so that we can shift the focus to like from accuracy and performance, but to like it's okay to making errors, and it's shift the focus to effort and I would say a growth mindset where we can benefit from errors and identify the gap of our knowledge, what part of the material that we do not know about. So these kind of activity, I think definitely can. I wouldn't say definitely. We have to test that in the classroom in the next study. But yes, but I hopefully it can facilitate a more supportive learning environment where students can feel can embrace the state of not knowing and feel a little bit more willing to making errors while studying.
David, you want to take a? I know you have lots of strategies for it.
So a bunch of things. One, but great. And this is fun. This is the first. This is the longest conversation that Ayanna and I talk all the time. We go out for drinks. We argue over liquor. It's really. We collaborate. So this is no arm wrestling yet. I think I've moved. Strategy. So one bit that is overlap, and it's totally. And I was thinking about this while you were speaking, Lenon. Is you said students? It's effortful, and they would rather be more relaxed. They'd rather do it takes, and people study system 1 and system 2 thinking, and people study thinking fast and slow, and it's easier to think quickly than it is to really engage in effort. I have good news. If you give students a vexing problem, if you give them something like, I don't know whether you're bothered by the question of whether the paper towel goes up faster. So I don't know that about you, but I promise you there are questions in physics that you'd say, whoa, wait a minute. That really bothers me. The bothering, that really bothers me, provides energy, provides motivation, provides I want to work on this. Is I think one of the means, and I guess I'm willing to believe it's going to be all. Anna's going to explain to me later why it's all retrieval strategies that I use in my course. There's a whole bunch of them. In fact, the whole of my course is designed around helping students engage with not knowing. So everything in the course, that's the first priority. Second priority is they're learning Newtonian physics when I teach, and I love teaching the first semester. There's very little information to learn. So it's a thing that I really love about it. You can write all the information on a 3x5 card in large letters, and that's it. But it's the engaging with the work that is the challenge. I say to them what I said to you. Scientists are people who don't know. Oh, you're confused? I don't say, let me help you with that. I say, cool. What are you confused about? Can you put it in words? If they put it in words, they ask a question. I say, awesome. That was fantastic. Actually, publicly, privately, feeling confused. If you think you know the answer to that question I posed of which one takes longer when I throw something in there and it's really clear to you, you're not doing as well as somebody who thinks, wait, I see arguments on both sides. and I can't quite reconcile them. If you can see arguments on both sides and you can reconcile them, well, that's great. Then you're in really good shape. But if you immediately say, no, I'm not confused by that, that's obvious. You're actually not doing as well. You don't have as good understanding. The feeling of confusion is a good feeling in doing science. So Duren and I have collaborated on studying chemists being exposed to a question that they don't know the answer to. Some do, some have heard it before, and then they know the answer, and it's not a situation like that for them. But there's a question that they don't know the answer to, and we watch them feel uncomfortable, but then they're chemists, they want to figure it out. And so they're vexed, it bothers them, and then they take time, sometimes past the time that was allotted for the interview, sometimes stopping Duren in the hallway to say, wait, I had another idea about that question that you posed, because they are interested in it. I tell students, scientists love not knowing. So if you're not knowing, you are feeling the feeling of a scientist. It is a good feeling. Seek it out. Look for it. The other thing I do, and I'm going long, but I'll just say, we give points on our problem sets, on exams, for articulating confusion. If you don't know the answer to a question, I don't ask questions that I think of as retrieval questions. I ask questions that are reasoning, thinking, having ideas questions. And I'm not looking for, have they retained the information? I'm looking for, are they engaging in learning as sense making? And when students on the exams say, I don't know the answer to this, I'm torn between this and this, they get credit on those questions. That is something that we're after. It is a bear for grad students to grade, yes. And we have to have lots of calibration meetings. I look at it and they look at it, but it's really important that they see confusion as a good thing.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to move. So I want to do one more question, then I want to open it up so that we can have questions from folks on Zoom and folks in the audience. But I have one last question for this group, and I'll start with Heather again, so that we can just hear from everybody. And the last question, and we've talked about the state of not knowing and how to encourage that. I guess there's a two-parter question. Are there states of not knowing that are unproductive? And how do we as educators and instructors try to come to recognize that and direct students back into a state of not knowing that results in productive, let's call it productive confusion that we'll talk about. Okay, Heather.
So I think the unproductive state of not knowing that I've seen, particularly with my incarcerated students, comes from a sense of, I can't do this, right? I don't know how, this is somehow monolithic and inaccessible to me. And I don't have the tools, but also I'm probably not smart enough to do this, right? And that is years and years of accretion of not having actually had anyone value what they could ask, right? Somebody shaming them in the past for asking questions, somebody punishing them for not knowing. Andrew, I don't know if you've seen this with your students as well, right? And so to encounter people who have learned to fear admitting confusion and not knowing, and figuring out how to make it safe not to know so that they actually can not know and start learning is the interesting challenge. And for me, it's often by, as you say, validating confusion. Oh, that's so interesting. I never thought of that thing you just brought up. Or teach me something I don't know so that you can see that I also don't know. That's a great, or that for me has been a great opportunity to say, hey, I don't know, you teach me. And then we can all be in a space where there's something we don't know. But I think it's whether it's a student in a carceral system or whether it's a student in our Medford campus classroom who has not had the experience of being in a space where it was safe not to know and being able to unpick that?
Well, let's go to you next, and we'll think and the last one.
Yeah, so I think let me get back to the literature's by retrieval practice. I'm so sorry. It's just my field of study. So yeah, there's some meta-analysis study showing that retrieval practice performance need to reach to a certain criteria level in order for the benefit of retrieval practice to emerge. So for example, you need during the initial learning phase, student need to reach at least like 50% or 60% of accuracy in order for the benefit of retrieval practice to emerge later in a delay test, like 2 days or a week from the initial learning stage. And so what does it tell? It tells us that sometimes uncertainty and not knowing can actually be counterproductive. And if we ask students to work on a problem that they have no clue, they have no idea, they have no prior knowledge to back it up, they have nothing to think about because there's no background knowledge on that at all, then it will be definitely counterproductive. So I would say that we need some scaffolding where, for example, we need to give students some clue on how to work on the problem, or at least give them a peer, like a mate, who is have a little bit more expertise on that to help them with. And it can definitely, that kind of uncertainty and not knowing can actually foster curiosities and engagement with the problem. However, if we just give them a problem that they have no clue, or give them a teammate who also doesn't have any clue, then just the two of them would get lost together, right? So I definitely think that we have to consider the level of uncertainties and the level of not knowing when we give students a problem to work on.
So yeah, that there's a lot of overlap, and this is maybe Ayanna's. You're retrieving your memory of what it's like to throw bits of paper, which is retrieving memory from your life experience, not retrieving memory from the information the instructor has delivered to you. So maybe that's a counterproductive state of not knowing, I think, is often, I think I can't do this. I think I'm not smart enough. I think that my not knowing reflects badly on me, what's so interesting about the interviews with the chemists that Duran conducted is that every single one of them expressed in one way or another embarrassment about not knowing in the context of a school interview. When they go back to their labs, they don't know all the time. Everything in their lab, they don't know. But somehow the context of school suggests that knowing is the thing you're supposed to do. So the counterproductive state is to be in a situation, a context where you think it reflects badly on you that you don't know. The chemists, of course, had this whole other kind of activity and participation really well developed that they couldn't just let it sit there. They had to go work on it and figure it out. And then the not knowing was like vexing and driving this harder sort of thinking. So I think that the feeling that you can't is an example of counterproductive. And I think the feeling of like a counterproductive thing that we'll see students do is there's some new question and they'll say, I don't know, he hasn't told us that yet. Or he said something about that in the lecture. There was something about that and they're not looking to retrieve from their life experience and coordinating with that because their conceptualization, and this is my challenge with retrieval as the main way of explaining to students, maybe there's a shift in what retrieval means, is their conceptualization that what they're retrieving is the information they'd been given, as opposed to retrieving what happened this morning as they were walking into school or something.
I would, one of the things, the anxiety, I would connect it if you see students or colleagues whose main concern is shame, right? At the end of the day, it's, will I feel shame either that I'm letting down the professor, that I'm letting myself down, that I'm going to be embarrassed in front of others? And so how do you find a way to acknowledge that and then help people move past that fear of being shamed because they they don't know. And I would also say in the arts and humanities, we sit in the state of not knowing. I never personally allow anyone to write in this paper, I will answer. I'm like, will you? Or will you argue? Because when you argue, we're back in a conversation. If you answer, it's just a monologue.
I'm just explicitly opening for questions. Those of you online, Heather will be doing the chat, so she'll raise her hand and we'll bring the microphone to her. And one of us will go around with the microphone. Dana will go around with the microphone in the room, so raise your hand. Feel free to enter comments or questions, and I see we have a lot already.
Okay, I saw.
So thank you for this interesting panel. I'm not sure if Ayanna and so how do I put this? I think there is a foundational thing that David and Ayanna probably agree on, but are not sort of willing to sort of admit, but that's a different story, which is you cannot retrieve something that you don't know, and you cannot argue, you cannot sort of think about anything that you don't know. So there is a foundational part where I feel like, okay, we're arguing here about retrieval. You have to have some sort of foundational information. And if that's not there, then there is no way you can ask a student to sort of, I mean, before this key, they have to know some logic or some sort of thing about physics, like the law of gravity. They have learned this, they have seen some of these things. And if they haven't seen it, they cannot sort of do either of what both of you are talking about. So that actually the part that I'm sort of worried is missing here. So we pre-assuming that all of our students or most of our students know things that we want to sort of help them to sort of elevate. And I'm not sure I'm there with you.
Do you want to start or should I?
Oh, Lanang wants to go in. Go for it.
I'm so sorry, because like I'm just such a big fan of retrieval practice, and I just have to defend it no matter what. But so I don't know if you guys are familiar with the pre-testing effect, in which the professor or the instructor asks questions about concept that they haven't delivered the lectures about it yet, and the expectancy here is that students can relate to their own learning experience or their own personal experiences and attempt to explain the concept in their own words and with given their own experience or personal experience, even though they don't have any like expertise on the concept itself. And that kind of activities can actually foster curiosities and subsequent engagement with the lectures and with the learning activities, and leading to better learning experiences of the concept. So I would say that, of course, it's really like, of course, we need some information to retrieve, right? If there's nothing, then there's nothing to retrieve. But I would say that the pool of knowledge that we have is much bigger than we thought. So even though we may not be familiar with a certain concept, we can still retrieve experiences related to it. And then it can build up our expertise about that concept later. Yeah.
I'll just add that I think that there is alignment, Caso, because, and I think that we're all sort of coming to see that alignment, because it, as Lanang just said, it's not just about, it doesn't have to be about retrieving what we just taught you, but it is about trying to use that information and also align it with all of your prior experiences and using that to make sense of the next step. So that's how I think we've been thinking about it. And looks like both Heather and David are interested in moving forward. So I'll pass this.
So I'm currently teaching a room full of folks who had never encountered Shakespeare before. So they didn't have a foundation. And so part of my task throughout the semester was to tap into, well, what do you already have an opinion about? Who's your favorite actor? What sport do you play? And then my job as the instructor is to help scaffold towards being able to have a conversation about Shakespeare, about performance. And it is often to be the instructor in the place of not knowing how I'm going to build this track as the train is running down it. But part of my job I see in that space where I'm entering a place where I cannot reasonably expect that people will have a prior experience of this, is to figure out ways, individual ways to bridge them into the conversation. Because again, from my position as a somebody who works in theater and performance studies, if I don't do that, then I'm actually the person who hasn't been able to create community and to create a safe space for them not to know. Why would they trust me after that?
Gosh, so we don't talk enough. It's nice to see you. And Heather, Carol Lee did research. I don't know whether you know on teaching in I think it was a middle school or low, like 9th grade, African American students who had never seen Shakespeare, but they knew a lot about signifying, and so she tapped into what they knew about signifying. And then read Zora Neale Hurston and made their way, and I forget all the details of it, but I know that those were beginning parts of it, and made their way to Shakespeare and did this like literary analysis of what was happening in Shakespeare based on what they did know. There is no one you can find, Casso, who'll have a conversation with you who doesn't know something about throwing a ball in the air or a rock in the air or their keys in the air or something in the air and seeing it come back down, or throwing a little bit of paper. We all come in with this really rich knowledge of the physical world. And you can ask an 8-year-old that question, 5-year-old, and they can do some stuff.
Another question, just in the interest of time.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting discussion. So I'm an engineer, and after listening to David, I'm really confused about whether the things I ask my students to do are retrieval or not. But one thing that I am 100% sure about is I never ask them to retrieve just one thing. It's always a skill, which is a sequence of things that they have to remember, and they have to remember to do it in the right order. Otherwise, it won't work. So I'm wondering what we know about retrieval practice in the context of needing to do a series of things instead of just one.
Yeah. So there's been a number of different kinds of studies looking at retrieval practice in different contexts. Some in chemistry, some in physics, including sort of sequences of events. It also is effective in that space. So that the act of just sort of reconstructing and putting things back together over and over again really does result in your ability to remember that a week and a month later, at least as we do it in the laboratory. So I would say yes, it has it's advantageous in that space.
So I tried, is this on?
Yeah.
I tried out, there we go. I tried out ungrading several times as a way of lowering the stakes. And from what I hear today, maybe what I should take away is, well, lowering the stakes really isn't enough. And I'm curious about your reactions and how ungrading might be best used as a tool, and what are ways to make it work well versus badly.
What is ungrading?
And please introduce ungrading so that I'm not talking.
I think I was in a CELT panel on ungrading a couple of years ago. Is that right?
It's highly likely.
So, and I practice ungrading in my upper level courses. Generally, and how I define ungrading is allowing students the opportunity to learn without the sort of stakes of having the assessment from the instructor. And so the way I implement it in those courses is I have them do self-assessments, I have them do peer-to-peer evaluations, and we do lots of feedback. And then and Lanang was actually part of that class last semester, we did that. We had them all assess what they think because I have to give a grade right at the end of the semester, what they think that their final grade should be based on everything, and to justify that. So that's ungrading. Now, ungrading in the context of making it, allowing students to embrace uncertainty. Is that the question? Anyone want to take it?
I have a wonderful advisee who I don't think is here. He's in Colombia, so he'd be on Zoom if he was here. I don't see his name, but Miguel Vasquez Vega is going to do his dissertation to study evidence of what happens in he says, unscoring, not ungrading. We don't, because we teach physics 11, they have to have a grade at the, and one of the little features of this is the scale. I tried to get a conversation going a few years ago when I was on the educational policy committee of not having grades count for the first year of college. And I was told, no, we can't talk about that. And we have not had a faculty conversation about it. That would be ungrading. We have to have grades. So he has a different approach to grading. He and Hugh Gallagher in physics, my colleagues there. And we have a little debate going, just like Ayanna and I think that we need to give them a kind of feedback scoring to say, you could be doing better. Our sense of how you're doing at this, but I want the sense of how you're doing to be something like engaging with confusion. So I'd like to have them get feedback when they hand in a problem set and they say, I didn't know what formula to use, or they just plug into a formula that looks right, but they don't consider multiple things. I would like to be giving them feedback, a low score, to say, you didn't consider multiple arguments. You didn't consider possibilities. So I think they need something. But we're going to find out. Miguel and Hugh think that it's going to be better doing it their way. I think it's better doing it my way. And we're going to let evidence find out. There's so much we don't know.
And question from the online folks.
Hey, we have a question from Professor Maritza Barros. She says, in the context of ancestral and cultural memory, how can we understand the process of, quote, not knowing as a space that both challenges and activates the retrieval of hidden or suppressed histories, particularly for marginalized communities whose histories have been distorted or erased? Could this process of rediscovery through learning serve as a form of ancestral retrieval, and how might this inform how we approach learning, memory, and knowledge in educational contexts?
So I assume you wanted it.
It's a hard question. That's such a great question. I hope that we get to meet and talk. Please seek me out so we can have this conversation over coffee at some point. I don't have a good answer for that question. The way that I think about, or the way that, and the perspective that I gave in the context of the talk is completely a Western traditional perspective on thinking about learning and memory. But you really can think about and break from that information processing approach, which is really sort of, it really informs the way that I do my research and the way that many of us do our educational practice, but it doesn't have to, right? So how do you get people to embrace and engage with states of knowing that doesn't necessarily rely on what they have actually consciously experienced and processed? I think that's how I think about that question. And I think that there are ways to do that, right? I think that there are ways to bridge to information that has been passed down generationally, that there are ways to really sort of consider the sort of non-conscious or implicit state of knowing, and not necessarily knowing where that comes from. But I don't have from a Western tradition, there's no scientific evidence that I can draw upon. So it'd be really nice to have that conversation in more detail at some point. Anybody else want to try it? Yeah.
I'm excited to see this actually emerging in our PhD program, where we have a lot of students who think about embodied practice as a way of learning, but also as scholarship. And we have students who think about Indigenous communities. We have students who think about diasporic communities and how they disrupt sort of traditional Western structures of knowing, either in their written scholarship, in their teaching practice, or even in the ways in which they create their responses in the classroom. So right now in our program, I'm seeing that more at the graduate level, and I'm excited for the ways in which they're bringing it into their undergraduate classrooms that they're offering. So that's been really exciting over the last decade to see that shift.
Thank you. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask one last question before I wrap us up. If you've met me in the last couple of years, you probably know that sometimes I think about AI. And I'm thinking that now there's this tool readily in front of roughly 2/3 of our students, at least weekly. What do you think impact this might have on retrieval practice? I can see it going a couple different ways, lowering anxiety if you're retrieval and it's really, in a space where nobody's evaluating you, or increasingly allowing you to sidestep any of the mental benefits of retrieval by just always getting an answer without even trying to retrieve it yourself. So what do you all think?
I can start. Yeah. AI is killing me inside. I actually use it. I use ChatGPT all the time. But what my students tend to be using it for is generating their own quiz questions. ChatGPT does not generate information that rigorously engages with them and the knowledge that they're trying to assess. So there's limitations there. That limitation might be overcome at some point when sort of the models grow and grow and grow. But right now, what I'm recognizing, and this is only anecdotal, is that students don't know enough to recognize that they are not engaging in the material in a very sort of deliberate and effortful way. So when they're engaging in that way, it's starting to look a little bit like study practice from my perspective. Anybody else want to?
Well, you remind me of a student I had once who said, well, I don't really need to do the reading because I can just, get the things I need to know from just whatever it might be. And so they said, for example, you've told me something about, I think it was Billie Holiday. And they repeated back what I'd said about Billie Holiday. And then I said, okay, well, I have a follow-up question. And I asked them a second question and they were like, oh, and I was like, see, tapped out on question 2. So I hope that was a kind of moment for them to recognize that the superficiality of, I don't need to know more than the answer was not enough, right? That maybe the fear of not knowing would come out by the second question. Yeah.
So for many years, many of us have been arguing against, so this is, what does retrieval mean? And what is the basic conceptualization of what happens in higher education and education in general? I think the basic conceptualization, the dominant conceptualization is the instructor knows stuff and they will communicate it to the students and then the students will know stuff. That there is information presented and the students do work to retain that information. And for many years, many of us have been arguing that's not a very good model of what happens, what should be happening in education. And we need to disrupt that. So the idea of retrieval practice, what it conjures up in students' minds, I think is consistent with that. And I want to disrupt that. That's, I think, a thing more for us to talk about more. Ayanna and I are colleagues on a constructive confusion project where we study how students will engage with, and Manan's involved in that too. So AI to me makes that unavoidable. Because if it's information, if you think of learning as receiving and retaining and then reproducing the information you heard, so repeating back what the instructor just told you, AI does that really well. So we don't need people doing that. For a long time, I talked about how I would do things. People expect when they come to a physics course that I'm going to show them how to calculate something, and then I'm going to pose them problems where they calculate that thing over and over again and get good at it. And I said, we used to need to teach you that. And then I take out my iPhone or whatever I have in my pocket, I wave it. I said, we don't need you for that anymore. This is way better than you'll ever be. So we need you for other sorts of things. And I think AI has now kind of shifted not only the tools we have to think with, but the goals of higher education can't be any more information retention because we don't need people doing that. So that's my main
Thank you. I just want to wrap us up. And I do want to circle back to this. So this is your chance to retrieve what you took away from this in a way. In online, we're not going to move you into breakout rooms just for time. We're going to have you do it in the chat. And here I'm going to give you 1 minute to turn to someone next to you and share, how does what the story you heard this morning relate to something you heard today?
And she said, oh wow, she realized that like bringing like so I was thinking about that, like, oh wow,
So I know that was way too short an amount of time, but I do want to make sure that we have time for lunch. So I'm going to encourage you to continue these conversations in the lunchroom. I'm just going to say what's happening next. And there is an exit survey for today, a poll, and I will put that poll up, but I will send it by email so we don't have to stay in the room and do that now. At 1 o'clock, there will be 2 workshops happening. One will be online, led by our colleagues from ETS, and that's applying learning sciences and ed tech tools in online, hybrid, and in-person spaces. CELT will be leading a workshop or a play space applying learning sciences in your classroom in the room at lunch at 1. If you're in person, you can still attend the online one if you wish, this room and the room right behind us if you want a quiet space to zoom in so that you can cross platforms. But I do want to thank all of our panelists today. They helped with the planning of this event. They helped with the panel and their time, and we're really very grateful for them for leading us in this conversation. So thank you, everyone, and we hope you have a wonderful lunch. We have some gifts for you here that Jean's going to give you. All right, thank you.
What's free? Sorry, helpful.
I'll have to